Good evening. This is John Smith, and welcome to Bible study. This is our Tuesday evening online Bible study from the Church of Christ in Weyburn, Saskatchewan. And we're in a series of lessons. We're at lesson number 10 right now from the book of 2 Corinthians. And if you are just joining us, we have reached the middle of chapter 6. And tonight we're going to look at a section from chapter 6, verse 14 to 7, verse 1. And that's the part of 2 Corinthians that we're going to cover this evening. So roughly half a chapter in the book. I was preparing for a longer segment, but there's a little bit of a deep dive that I want to make in tonight's passage and for us to be blessed by this. So whenever you're accessing this Bible study, you may not be picking up on it live with us on Tuesday evening. It may be some other time where you are. It may be later in the week. Today is December the 21st. So before I'm online again with you for Bible study, it will be Christmas Day. And the Christmas holidays will be upon us. So I want to wish every one of you a blessed Christmas and a good time to be alone with your family, if that's what you're doing, or if you're going to be mixing with some others, or if you're just going to be home by yourself. I hope nevertheless that as this year winds up, that you will be reminded of the blessing of Christ. And we'll look forward to good things in the new year. So, I'm going to lead us through a Bible study that I hope you will follow along with in your Bible. If you don't have a copy of your Bible and one is nearby and you need to pause to grab your Bible, that would be great. And please find 2 Corinthians and chapter 6 and starting at verse 14. I'm actually going to read, first of all, from verses 14. I have to take a look. I'll read the whole section from verse 14 to 7, verse 1, and then we'll back up and go through it piece by piece. Do not be mismatched with unbelievers, for what partnership is there between righteousness and lawlessness? Or what fellowship is there between light and darkness? What agreement does Christ have with Beliar? Or what does a believer share with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God, as God said, I will live in them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. Therefore come out from them and be separate from them, says the Lord, and touch nothing unclean. Then I will welcome you, and I will be your Father, and you shall be my sons and daughters, says the Lord Almighty. Since we have these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from every defilement of the body and of spirit, making holiness perfect in the fear of God. So I want to begin with those first few verses, verses 14 and into the beginning of verse 16. You know, 14, the first part of verse 14 says, do not be mismatched with unbelievers. And I think some people have extracted that statement out of this context and applied it to all kinds of things. What this context is focusing on is about us as believers having moral conduct, upright character, and appropriate worship that makes us distinct from the world, that makes us distinct from others. I think this is a completely different context and application than 1 Corinthians 5, verses 9 through 11. Some people make that connection, But I just want to read that passage just for a moment, just to point out the difference in the context and the difference of things being talked about. 1 Corinthians 5, verses 9 through 11. In 1 Corinthians 5, Paul, this is his first letter to the Corinthians, is addressing an immoral situation within that congregation. And he says this, starting at verse 9. I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral persons, not at all meaning the immoral of this world, or the greedy and robbers or idolaters, since you would then need to go out of the world. But I am now writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother or sister, who is sexually immoral or greedy, or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or robber. Do not even eat with such a one. Now, the reason why I read that was because that, as you hear very specifically, is talking about an in-church situation. He's not referring to, don't associate with anybody out in the world, because you can't really not live in the world. But he is talking about having close fellowship and having a relationship with someone in the church that is living immorally, and how you need to address that situation in the fellowship. We're not going to spend time there, but I just want you to see that in 2 Corinthians, the focus is different. In 2 Corinthians, he's talking about us being ambassadors for Christ to others, to be ministers of reconciliation to people who don't know God, who need to be reconciled to him. So when it says in our passage, do not be mismatched with unbelievers, he's now talking about a different situation. And what he does talk about then through these next three verses, 14, 15, and 16, he uses 5 statements that are distinctions. He talks about what partnership is there with righteousness and lawlessness. So this is a pattern that he's going to use for 5 statements. He's going to say what partnership, what fellowship, what harmony, or accord is another word that could be used there, what portion or share, or what agreement. He uses 5, and these are synonyms. They all really mean the same thing. What partnership, what association, what fellowship do these things have in common? And the 5 pairs of things that he mentions are really distinct from each other, are opposites. What partnership and the first pair is, does righteousness have with lawlessness? Okay, so it's righteousness and lawlessness. And then he says, what fellowship does light have with darkness? That's the second pair, light and darkness. Then he says, what harmony does Christ have with Beliar? That's the third relationship, Christ with Beliar. The fourth relationship is what do believers have in common or share, or what portion do they have with unbelievers? Okay, so it's believers and unbelievers. And then the last pairing, the fifth pairing, is what agreement is there between the temple of God on one hand and idols on the other hand. So the focus of these 5 pairs has to do with moral conduct, it has to do with upright character, and it has to do with appropriate worship. You can see that reflected in the different distinctions that he's calling us to show. As ambassadors of Christ, we should be associated with righteousness, not darkness, with righteousness, not lawlessness, with light, not darkness, with Christ, not Beliar. We're going to spend some time on that word Beliar. as believers, not unbelievers, and as the temple of God, and honoring the temple of God, not idols. Okay, so those are the 5 distinctions that people ought to see different about us than they would see with others who are not reconciled to God and who are not being ambassadors for Christ. I really think exploring this word Beliar is really important. There is no harmony or accord between Christ or Beliar, verse 15 begins with. Well, what does that mean? The word Beliar, or your translation might say Belial. It depends on if it's drawing from the Hebrew root of that word. It does actually come from the Hebrew, but of course it's being used in the Greek text of the New Testament. But it's from the Greek, and literally the name means wickedness, worthlessness, and destruction. That name is being attached really to Satan here, Christ or Beliar. The name is used for Satan. This is a name used for Satan in some contemporary to the New Testament biblical literature, mostly Jewish literature. Satan is referred to as Beliar or Belial, and sons of Belial or children of Belial are mentioned in contrast to children or sons of God. Why does Paul use this name? You know, he could have used the name Satan. He could have just said the devil. He could have said the tempter. He could have said the liar. You know, which is language used in the rest of the New Testament to refer to Satan. This is the only place we see this name in the New Testament. It's an Old Testament word. It appears many times in the Old Testament, translated. You don't see the word Belial. What you do is you see it translated into what the name means. But why does he use this word here? Well, I think we're going to explore that in the Old Testament passages. Some of them, we're not going to look at all of them where it's used, because that will help us understand what Paul is trying to communicate about how we as ambassadors from Christ need to have a distinct witness to the world around us. There needs to be something distinct about us. So let's see how this is applied in the Old Testament. And as I said, the word in the Old Testament is not used as a name as it is here. It's used in association, though, to describe people and things. Okay, so let's look at some examples. For instance, in 2 Samuel, the book of 2 Samuel, chapter 22, verses 1 to 7. I'm going to turn and read these passages, and so bear with me. It may take longer than I want it to. 2 Samuel 22, verses 1 through 7. David spoke to the Lord the words of this song on the day when the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. He said, "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer, my God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shelter and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold and my refuge, my Savior. You save me from violence. I call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised. I am saved from my enemies. For the waves of death encompassed me. The torrents of perdition assailed me. The cords of Sheol entangled me. The snares of death confronted me. In my distress I called upon the Lord. To my God I called. From his temple he heard my voice, and my cry came to his ears." So this is a portion, it's just the first portion. It goes on in chapter 22 to record the rest of this psalm. It's really a psalm that's recorded in the book of Samuel of David as he's fleeing and hiding from and trying to deal with his enemy, who is King Saul, that David has been chosen to replace. And so King Saul is trying to put David to death because he sees him as a threat. So here the Belial reference comes in those verses, in verse 5, where it says, the torrents of perdition assailed me. The torrents of Belial assailed me. And if we didn't have 4 parallel statements here, we might not know what he's talking about. But listen to the 4 statements again. The waves of death encompassed me. The torrents of perdition assailed me. The cords of Sheol entangled me. The snares of death confronted me. So here that word Belial, in one of these 4 parallel phrases, is referring to either the perversion of his enemy Saul, who is continually seeking David's life. And so the emphasis by using this word is that it focuses on the unrighteous character and lawless actions of Saul towards David. Or it could just be referring to death itself, since it's said in these parallel phrases that describe the place of the dead, the threshold of the grave, or Sheol, which David faced many times in his life. He constantly was looking at and engulfed by the waves of death, or the torrents of perdition. Belial, that's the word, the torrents of Belial. So that, of course, draws on the meaning of that word, which means destruction. So that's part of the destruction, and maybe referring to the unrighteousness and lawless actions of Saul. But you can see how then Paul is setting that as an opposite, as a distinction to Christ. We want to be associated with Christ, not with lawlessness and destruction and death. Okay, another use of the word is in 1 Samuel 1, verses 12 to 16. 1 Samuel. So if you're in 2 Samuel, just turn back to the book of 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel 1, and I'll read verses 12 to 16. And this is the woman named Hannah, who is the mother of Samuel. But at this point, she is childless. She's been barren. And she's praying, she's pleading in prayer to God for a child. And so that's what we're reading about here. As she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying silently, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she was drunk. So Eli said to her, "How long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Put away your wine." But Hannah answered, "No, my lord, I am a woman deeply troubled. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation all this time." When Hannah describes herself, do not regard your servant as a worthless woman. That's our word, Beliar, worthless. Okay? And again, she's defending her character, her uprightness. Eli, the priest, saw her, the high priest saw her and thought, "Here, what's this woman doing here near the house of God in a drunken stupor?" That's what it looked like was happening. But really, she was earnestly, silently, but earnestly mouthing the words of a prayer to God, pleading for a child. And so when Eli calls her out on hey, if you're stone drunk, go somewhere else. Don't come here and defile things here. And she says, "Oh, no. I'm, don't take me for a worthless or an unrighteous or a lawless woman. I am pouring out my heart to God." And so that helps us to understand what the difference is between Christ and Belial. Belial has to do with being unrighteous, about being immoral, about being lawless, and but we want to be associated with Christ. Paul wants us as ambassadors, as ministers of reconciliation, to be characterized by Christ, by an upright character, and so that's what's portrayed in all five of the distinctions in 2 Corinthians that we looked at, but especially in contrasting Christ and Beliar. That's why they have no agreement or fellowship together. And then another use is Psalm 101, and the first, it's an 8-verse psalm, so it's all the verses of Psalm 101. Let's just turn there for a moment. Psalm 101, verses 1 to 8. And again, I'm taking a moment to turn there. If you need to pause when I go to these passages and then turn it back on, the video, that's great. I will sing of loyalty and of justice to you, O Lord. I will sing. I will study the way that is blameless. When shall I attain it? I will walk with integrity of heart within my house. I will not set before my eyes anything that is base. And that's the word Belial there, the word for base. I hate the work of those who fall away. It shall not cling to me. Perverseness of heart shall be far from me. I will know nothing of evil. One who secretly slanders a neighbor I will destroy. A haughty look and an arrogant heart I will not tolerate. I will look with favor on the faithful in the land, so that they may live with me. Whoever walks in the way that is blameless shall minister to me. No one who practices deceit shall remain in my house. No one who utters lies shall continue in my presence. Morning by morning I will destroy all the wicked in the land, cutting off all evildoers from the city of the Lord. That's a psalm of David. Sounds like from the time when he's a king. But you can see what he's talking about there. I will not set my eyes before anything that is base, not anything that is wicked, not anything that is Beliar or Belial. So here it's applied to things that are done, that are immoral and without virtue, that are unrighteous. And so again, that helps us with the understanding of what Paul is saying, that Christ has nothing to do with Beliar. And as people who are ambassadors of Christ, we need to not be involved in unrighteousness. And the reason why I read that whole psalm is because there are a lot of good things in that psalm that talk about how to, in contrast, not be associated with unrighteousness. Things like a loyalty and justice, studying the way of the blameless and trying to attain it, walking with integrity of heart within my house. Those, and there's other things as you go through that psalm. There's some very specific things there that have to do with having virtue, with having righteousness, with having good character, with being, as Paul would want us to be, good ambassadors of Christ and ministers of reconciliation, not the other end of the spectrum. Okay, so I think all of these passages are helping us to understand this, aren't they? There's two more. Deuteronomy 13, verses 12 and 13. Getting a good tour of the Old Testament here. But I wanted you to see why Paul used this word. Because when you just read it in 2 Corinthians, you say, well, why does he call Satan Beliar? Why didn't he just say Satan? Why did he use that word as a name? Well, there's more. Deuteronomy 13, verses 12 and 13. If you hear it said about one of the towns that the Lord your God is giving you to live in, that scoundrels from among you have gone out and led the inhabitants astray, of the town astray, saying, let us go and worship other gods whom you have not known. And then from verse 14, he talks about how to deal with those scoundrels. But that's the word. That's our word, Belial. People of bad character. And what are they doing? These scoundrels are saying, let us go and worship other gods. So again, this section in 2 Corinthians 6 is talking about moral conduct, upright character, and appropriate worship. That's where its focus is. That's where our focus needs to be if we're going to be ministers of reconciliation and serve as ambassadors of Christ. So one more passage, and this is in the book of Judges. The book of Judges. Judges chapter 19, verses 22 and 23. The time of the judges was a very dark time in the history of Israel. They were in this cycle of always falling away from God, and God had to send some righteous leader to bring them back to repentance, but then they would fall again. And so during one of their dark times here in Judges 19, there's a Levite who's traveling through the land. He stops at the city of Gibeah, at the town square, and an old man from the city takes him to his house to put him up for the night, and this is what happens. It's similar to what happened in the city of Sodom to one of God's servants. Judges 19 verses 22 and 23. While they were enjoying themselves, the men of the city, a perverse lot. There's our word Belial, or Beliar is used there to describe them. A perverse lot. Surrounded the house and started pounding on the door. They said to the old man, the master of the house, bring out the man who came into your house so that we may have intercourse with him. And the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said, no, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Since this man is my guest, do not do this vile thing. So these men were a perverse lot. And the man of the city is begging with them, do not act so wickedly. Do not do this vile thing. These are all associated with the word Belial. And so you see why it is that Paul says Christ has nothing to do, with Belial. And those of us who want to be ambassadors of Christ, that's the encouragement and the instruction that we're being given. It has to do with our conduct. It has to do with our character. And as some of the passages have indicated, it also has to do with our worship. So here's the application questions of this. In what ways is Christian living distinct from worldly living? We need to think about that. People should see a distinction, should see a difference in our lives from what they see everywhere else. We need to reflect uprightness, righteousness, holiness. We may not be perfect. Well, we won't be perfect, but we do need to, as much as we can, be not associating with things that are wicked and that are evil and that are destructive and that lead to death. And instead we need to focus on the things of Christ, on the things that are light, not darkness, on the things that are righteous, not lawless, on the things that are good and not evil. All of those distinctions that Paul makes there. That's where our focus and our attention needs to be. People should see that. So in what ways, we need to think about this, in what ways is Christian living distinct from worldly living? Reflect on that some. Another application question. How do we as worshipers of God eliminate the worship of idols in our lives? So some of the meaning of Beliar, as we've looked at here, has to do with people that were worshiping idols and influencing the other people of God to worship idols. You might look at this and think, well, okay, that might have been important for Paul to write to the Corinthians about, because people worshipped idols. They had temples to all these different gods and stuff. And certainly in ancient Israel, that was the problem. That was the big problem that the children of Israel kept falling into. They weren't faithful in worship of God, and they worshiped the idols of the nations around them. But that's maybe not very applicational to us in our time. We don't have any idols? It's interesting. I think we worship a lot of idols. We may not call them that. Actually, we do call them that sometimes. There's a television show called American Idol. But really what we're talking about is all of those things, or all of those people that can take the place of God in terms of our devotion, our use of time and resources, and our commitments, and our money in our lives. Things that we idolize, or people. Might be entertainers, might be professional athletes, might be other kinds of celebrities, musicians, movie stars, whatever. Or it might be things that are actually much more personal to us, like our possessions, like our clothes, maybe our vehicle, or our recreational equipment, or activities, or destinations, our hobbies. Maybe it's certain individuals that we idolize, right? And it's not that we shouldn't have hobbies. It's not that we shouldn't have interests and things that we that occupy our attention, and it's not that we shouldn't have recreation. It's not that we shouldn't have devotion to our work and to our family, and it's not that we can't have possessions and live in houses and drive cars. That's not the point. That doesn't, just because we have those things in our life, or those people in our life, doesn't automatically mean that we're worshiping idols. But when we start to give all of our time and all of our resources and all of our attention to something, and it takes away from our worship and our devotion and our service to God, it gets in the way, takes the place of, then that thing, whatever it is in our life, playing games, watching television, spending money, whatever it is, if that is getting in the way of me, I'm going to make it personal, and several of the things that I've mentioned are personal to me. If those things are taking a bigger place in my life and interfering with my worship to God and my service and devotion to God, then you know what? I'm worshiping idols. I'm involved in idolatry. And that's what makes this very real and very applicable. So when the New Testament talks about this, and Paul talks about it in some of his letters, and of course it's in the Old Testament prophets and in much of the Old Testament, it actually is very relevant to us. This idea that we need to put away idols. We need to be devoted to the temple of God, not to idols, Paul is saying here. And of course in Paul's letters of both 1st and 2nd Corinthians, the temple of God, that's not referring to a building somewhere. It's not referring to the Jewish temple in Jerusalem that was destroyed in 70 AD. He's not talking about the temple in that sense. When he talks about the temple, he talks very specifically and describes the temple as being the body of Christ, the fellowship of believers. We are a temple of God, a temple in which God dwells. And so that's why we need to be devoted to holiness and uprightness and righteousness, is because God, we represent God. We are where God resides. and where God makes his presence known in this world, in the lives of Christians. And that's what it means to be involved in the ministry of reconciliation. So it's very distinct. There's just a little bit more to go here. Let me read verses 16 to 18 now from 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 16 to 18. What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God. As God said, I will live in them and walk among them. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Therefore come out from them and be separate from them, says the Lord, and touch nothing unclean. Then I will welcome you, and I will be your father, and you shall be my sons and daughters, says the Lord Almighty. So those verses are actually an assembly, an assemblage, I don't know what else to call it, of covenant words from the Old Testament. Paul, being the teacher of the law, his background as a teacher of the law, a Pharisee, he is so familiar with the Old Testament scriptures, and he draws all of this from the covenant language of the Old Testament. For instance, in verse 16, when he says, I will live in them and walk among them, I will be their God, and they shall be my people, that's almost a direct quote of Leviticus 26:12. When he says, therefore come out from them and be separate from them, says the Lord, and touch nothing unclean, that's almost a direct quote of Isaiah 52:11. He's using the language of the prophets and of the covenant of the Old Testament. In verse 18, I will be your father and ye shall be my sons and daughters, says the Lord Almighty. This language is used several times in the Old Testament. It's used about the family of David in 2 Samuel 7 and verse 14, the lineage of David that would continually be raised on the throne. It's used of the whole nation of Israel several times in Isaiah. Isaiah 43 and verse 6 is a good example. You are my sons and daughters, God says. I will be your father. He says when talking about David's reign. So Paul is using all of this language of covenant to try and impress upon us as ambassadors for Christ to be fully devoted. And so he wraps up this section, and it's kind of interesting that the person who split up 2 Corinthians into chapters, which wasn't the Apostle Paul, didn't keep this verse, the first verse of chapter 7, with the words that we've been studying from chapter 6, because really this is a summary statement of where we've been. Chapter 7 and verse 1. Since we have these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from every defilement of body and of spirit, making holiness perfect in the fear of God. And so there's just one more thing we need to talk about here, and that's this idea of making holiness perfect. This is not saying that we have to be perfect in order to be ministers of reconciliation, in order to be ambassadors of Christ. That's not what's meant by saying making holiness perfect. The word that's used here for making perfect, epiluntes, is used by Paul in several other places that helps us understand what he means. And actually, you may have a translation that says makes complete, or says it in a different way, says perfects holiness or something like that. Because that's really a more appropriate way of understanding it. In 2 Corinthians 8 and verse 6, for instance, Paul says this, so that we might urge Titus that as he had already made a beginning, so he should also complete this generous undertaking among you. So something that Titus had begun and these people had begun, Titus was encouraged to work with them to bring it to completion. It's that same word. So it doesn't mean perfection in the way that we think of, without any error. It means to complete something that you have begun. That's what it means. And finish what you started, in other words. And so it doesn't mean that you can't represent Christ until you are completely perfect. Otherwise, none of us could be ambassadors of Christ and ministers of reconciliation, at least not right now, not me. But that's not what it means. And Philippians 1 and verse 6 says this, I am confident of this, that the one who began a good work among you will bring it to completion by the day of Jesus Christ. There's that word again. Will bring it to completion. Will bring it to perfection in the day of Christ. We all know, at least I know, that I'm not going to be perfect until the day of Christ. Every day I manage somehow to prove that I'm not perfect. It happens. But I'm in the process. And that's what Paul is talking about. We can be ambassadors of Christ and ministers of reconciliation because we are in the process. And as long as we're committed to that process and people can see that we're committed to that process, we can be effective at bringing them into the process, at helping them be reconciled to God, and helping them get on this journey to begin the work of sanctification that Christ will complete on the day of Christ, okay, at the final day. That's when we will all reach perfection before God. And ultimately, Christ is the one who completes the work of perfecting us. Well, I hope this study this evening has been beneficial to you. The next lesson will begin in the new year. We won't have a lesson next Tuesday or next week, whenever it is you usually find us online for the Bible study. I'm away taking a week to be with family. But again, I want to wish all of you a good holiday season. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and may God bless you. And remember, and this may be the last time I say this in this calendar year, I'm going to come up with a different expression in 2022. But in 21, He is still the one.